Welcome to the God is Not an Asshole podcast. If you are one of the many people done with religious dogmatism, hang on. You might sense transcendence, but your church or other faith community never seem to get off the ground. You realize that honoring your conscience means more than fitting in and keeping hard-to-explain rules? Hang on. You could probably think of the goodness in your tradition, and you tried your best to save that baby, but there's so much bathwater. Join your hosts, David Norman Moore Jr. in California and Carrie Connolly in New Jersey, who are collaborating to bring on guests who have found life on the other side of fundamentalism. Guests with stories of how they have liberated themselves from beliefs that divide us from each other. None of our guests' narratives are identical, but we hope you'll find something in common with each of them. We invite you to experience our common bond as we all inspire even more of us to embrace the true self.
You know, one thing that we enjoy is the autobiography of Malcolm X. I think you might enjoy it more than I do because you've read it every summer since you were 16 years old. And the thing that stands out to me is that you have the capacity. I think that generally any informed African American can find flaws, if you will, but he's in the pantheon of people you don't criticize sometimes. You know, it's like, you know, I don't want to bring Brother Malcolm down, you know, because somebody else might see me pulling him down off the shelf. But you were able to graciously, identify his lack of awareness of indigeneity. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, I mean, I love Malcolm X. With all the flaws, he was the most important sort of historical figure for me as a young Afro-Indigenous male when I was having a hard time in high school. And so no one can talk bad about Malcolm X around me at all. With all the contradictions and sort of critiques that I think
Let me
are
interrupt
legitimate.
real quick and ask, where were you going to high school?
I went to Everett High School
in
Lansing, Michigan.
Okay, go ahead.
So where Magic Johnson went to high school.
Yeah.
And also Malcolm X, of course, lived in Lansing for a while. So
yeah.
It meant a lot to me in a variety of capacities. And even now, I listen to Malcolm speeches weekly. If I'm writing and I'm a little stuck, I'll put a few different Malcolm X documentaries on in the background. So, and I'm just putting all these qualifiers out to say, this is how much I love Malcolm X.
Thank you.
But in his own sense of nationalism and constructing, because John Henrik Clarke, I think, fantastically put it this way. Although he's prefacing thing when he was a member of the Nation of Islam, as the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us thus and so, these are really Malcolm's drawn out thoughts based on what he had learned initially, right? I mean, and you can trace this out, I think, pretty easily. You're like, well, he was saying, I don't think Elijah Muhammad said that at all. This is Malcolm's extraction of this and deep analysis and thought. And of course, he's reading widely from Elder Mitchell's bookstore and so forth. But his conception of Black nationalism, even after he left the nation and is becoming more international and developing understandings of colonialism, he, like many Black figures during the time, are constructing a Black future or the idea of a Black future based on indigenous erasure. James Baldwin does the same thing in his very important debate with the conservative William Buckley. And in developing that, when he's talking about the development of Manhattan, or even talking about the genocide as a past tense thing instead of an ongoing process of colonialism that's happening to indigenous peoples, it's that erasure, which is a foundational part of also the United States' identity, right? So it feeds into colonialism, which is about taking land, but also creating narratives and discourses that almost eliminate the possibilities of indigenous peoples existing in the present and certainly not in the future, right? And so Malcolm and others fell into that. The one exception to this during the time period, of course, was Stokely Carmichael, who changed his name to Kwame Ture. He was adamant from 1969 up until his passing in 1998 that what became the U.S. was indigenous land. And he had developed critiques of settler colonialism in Zimbabwe, of course, South Africa, in Palestine as well. He had developed all these critiques in a very short period of time, which is just incredible. But that's just the sort of gifted thinker and traveler that he was in thinking about that. And he developed relationships with indigenous peoples all the way up to his death. So, for example, a speech he gave in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1975, he explicitly says that this is indigenous land. This is not Black people's land, and we need to be a good relationship with Native peoples, which in my analysis is remarkable and one of the few, if not only, I'm sure there's an exception somewhere, people that are very well-known activists who explicitly stated that point. And I think it's a powerful example of where even Black activists and radicals should go in understanding this.
We started off talking about the doctrine of discovery, and the title of this podcast is "God is not an asshole," right? And in my own journey in my own little lane over here, I've been thinking a lot about the ways in which European indigenous populations were decimated by Christian colonialism, right? By the ways and the ways that our practices, languages, religions, music, yes. My Irish music is still here, but have been decimated, and we've lost it, right? Lost our own homes in a way, and then came here, and it was so much easier for us to assimilate into the hierarchy of whiteness, and now we are white, right? And but I want us to get back to this idea of Christian colonial, the church's responsibility in colonizing the world, the doctrines and the belief system that insists on spreading this word, and the way that it was used by the Pope, during the people, those papal bulls that were initiated were basically legal loopholes, because the idea was you can't go out and colonize a Christian nation, but you're supposed to go out and convert all these people, but there was no real desire to convert them, because then they couldn't conquer them, they couldn't plunder their land and rape and pillage and do all of the things, right? So I want us to get back to that somehow about we talked a little bit about metaphysics, we talked a little bit about the doctrine of discovery, we talked about the ways that in which indigenous people have been decimated, but I want us to get back to this idea of like the church's responsibility in all of that. And what are we going to do about that? Where is the imagination for redemption for this institution that has done so much harm?
I don't know if there is redemption.
I don't either.
and I think in pessimism, sometimes you call it pessimistic, but it's really idealistic in the sense of constantly critiquing and thinking about the limitations of possibility. I think in there you find a lot of freedom to imagine, but there's so historically, of course, the church, but I want to talk specifically to the Black church and some of the roles. For instance, when I was growing up, going to church 6 days a week, 5-6 days a week, you're just infused with this propaganda around, for example, Palestine and Israel, as a very sort of modern notion of colonization.
That happens in white evangelical fundamentalist churches as well.
Right.
Yeah, big time. Yeah, absolutely.
And the Christian supremacy of we need to redeem Israel, a complete ignoring of this is a religious conflict. Sure, there's some components of that, but it's just, basic colonization. And the role in educating or miseducating people to believe this is sort of God's divine will. And it just reverberates into the present. That was the foundation. This is God's will to colonize, to include and save the barbarians or destroy the barbarians. right? That was a sort of foundational notion of Christianity in its early stages, Christian colonialism, as you called it, Carrie. So there's so much that needs to be done, and I think churches need to take responsibility, not only apologizing, but finding ways to offer recompense for some of those things. And if you hold a bunch of land, maybe you should return that, right? That's like Catholic Church is kind of the easy one to target in that sort of sense, because they're probably one of the largest landholding entities in the world, if not the largest one. And even at the local level, I don't think local churches can be absconded for dealing with ongoing issues as well. Like, have some outreach, and it can't be outreach to the extent of, hey, we want to proselytize. No, I still hate that to this day. Like, it's just coercive in a certain way. Like, I live close to Skid Row, and I'm driving, and there's a preacher there giving out food, which I'm not opposed to, of course. But the whole point of giving out the food is to proselytize instead of just giving out the food that people need. You don't need to proselytize and give out food to people. So there's some just small, basic things, both very macro and even at local levels, that can be done without expectations.
I fear, though, I do a lot of consulting with churches, specifically white churches with big, huge savior complexes and the whole idea of, community service projects has taken on such a consumeristic, how can I get my warm and fuzzies today, right? How can I feel good about myself today? Let me go, put a sandwich in a bag and bring it down to, a place I normally don't go. And now I can feel good about myself. There's a lot of that specifically in the white church. And, I fear a performative, again, pat on our own backs around, we'll do a land acknowledgement in the beginning of our liturgy. Great. We did a land acknowledgement at the beginning of our liturgy. That's an important step because a lot of people would never have even known that. Right. But what does that actually do to move to bend the moral arc of the universe further toward justice? Right. Like that in and of itself doesn't do a lot. And, I'm always so cautious about, especially when I'm working with a church, to caution them about how exactly they do feed bellies, because feeding bellies can run the risk of making us feel really, really good about ourselves, but it doesn't do anything to change the problem. And in fact, in the back end, we're doing a whole bunch of things that are going to prop up the very system that creates those hungry bellies that make us feel good when we feed them, right? So I'm always trying to push us toward dismantling those things. I don't necessarily know that I do a good job or how to do that, but that's always where my brain is going. How can we really do that well? And I think doing it without, evangelism is a really good start. It's a good start, but it's nowhere near the finish. There's so much more that we have to do. And again, I have a complete failure of imagination there, but I'm willing to ask the questions. I'm willing to push people to think about it because I don't think we think about that enough, especially as a church, as people who say we love God.
It reminds me of the social media shaming of what's the mega church millionaire bestseller author person, Joel Osteen?
Which one? Joel Osteen? Yeah. Yeah.
During, I think I believe his church is based in Houston, maybe, or Houston, somewhere in that Houston. And the flooding or whatever had happened, and not even willing to open the doors initially, right? There's but there's also a concern with their nonprofit status as well. And I'm like, if you have all that money, the least you could do is build up housing with no expectations.
And maybe to me, what validates their work, at least in their own minds and in society's minds, is how many people of color participate in that. They have some of the biggest names in Black and brown music artistry who are, part of their staff. And, they would probably call themselves a multicultural or diverse church.
Yep.
It's DEI before DEI.
Yeah, exactly. I'm also reminded of a small nonprofit. I'm 15 minutes outside of Newark, New Jersey, and so that when I was involved in a large, skinny jean pastor, shiny tooth church back in the day, I was in charge of community service, and I would go out and partner with these organizations. And I remember visiting one particular organization. And I was just thinking about this the other day. And as I'm thinking about land ownership now and in this conversation and the way we hoard it and use it and lord it over the most vulnerable people, because they had a program that they had a soup kitchen in this facility, and it was a shelter, and they would feed people, but they would only give them one meal. But if they were willing to participate in a 6-month program or something, they could actually get housing and 3 squares a day, but they had to show up for this class, which was, of course, indoctrination. It was, of course, evangelism and all that. But also, as they took me on the tour, they were so proud to show me this really big area that was completely unused, right? It was wide open space that they did not use. They already had a part that was for women. There was a part for men. And they said, we really want to open up this part for families, but we're really concerned that we're going to get some LGBTQ in there. And so we don't want to do that.
Did they even use the term LGBT? Did they even use the term LGBT? They didn't say homosexuals? Or
that's a good question.
I'm pretty sure they probably said homosexuals, right? And so they were like, what happens if we get, a homosexual couple in here? What would we do? Because we want to treat them with dignity. The travesty, they said they wanted to treat them with dignity, and they didn't think that they could do that when they turned them away. Just let them give them a place to sleep. And, so the fact that they were hoarding property, space, shelter, food for it was one of the last times I could be part of that after that conversation. That was one of the last times. It was very close to my end there. So it's just such a, I think that the reason I bring it up is because I just want to make people aware of the very real ways in which land ownership, small and large, systemically does harm to people, does real harm to the most vulnerable.
Any thoughts on that,
That's
Kyle?
all I got.
I'm just at a loss of words with that example. It's infuriating.
Mm-hmm.
With, parents kicking out trans kids and their kids. Imagine them having housing and food and still being able to complete education, whatever that they, really wanted to do or plan to do, and the kind of cool things that they could do in life, right? Because it's a child. They just need some support, but they're concerned about their gender, sexuality, or I don't even have a real response. It's always infuriating, though.
We're coming up actually the hour, and we asked you for an hour. Before I stop, I'm going to ask you to say something about hip hop beats, indigenous rhymes. But before that, the reason I asked you where you were when you were growing up, Lansing, Michigan, and your interest in Malcolm X and all of that is I'm a lifelong Californian, and when I grew up, when I came of age, there was no internet or anything, and the media was very restrictive, mass media. Mm-hmm. So I hardly knew anything about Malcolm X, hardly knew anything about the civil rights movement, Dr. King. I hardly knew anything about these things. But one person they could not keep away from me. So he became, I think, who Malcolm X is to you is Muhammad Ali, because in sports they had to follow him. And so he was my inspiration. He is, I think he might fulfill the role that Malcolm plays for you, because he empowered me. And then after I graduated high school, I went to University of California, and everybody who was Black that I knew had a poster of Angela Davis. You know, they didn't have King. They didn't have Malcolm. They didn't have, a few had Black Moses, Isaac Hayes. But the one that everybody had was Angela Davis. And so she became our empowerment, a source of dignity for us. And so I can kind of relate to what, because I did discover Malcolm in time. We need our people to empower us. We need the people who dare, the people, who take risks, like the two men in their 20s in Tennessee who were just ejected from the legislature. They fire me up like a Malcolm or a Muhammad Ali. You have any thoughts on those brothers?
Yeah, I thought it was really slick about how they're calling out the people for why they have not been kicked out of, kicked out of the legislature for peeing on someone's seat, pedophilia, all sorts of things, which is just wild to me. But people protesting gun rights, right? And amazing. And certainly we need more Black people to look up to. I'm working on something right now around the lack of imagination of Black celebrities as well, because it's sort of, they should use their platforms more. And my question is why? Some of them should not be using any platform to advocate anything for Black people. This is not Muhammad Ali's era, right? And there ain't too many Muhammad Ali's out there, even today, as far as the scope and the analysis of what they're trying to accomplish. But quickly, I think hip hop beats, I actually want to write a remix version of that. But it's to say that indigenous peoples engage in modern culture, identity production, specifically through hip hop. And there's some really good hip hop artists, indigenous hip hop artists out there that I wish got a little bit more exposure, but that's also the nature of colonialism, to say that I didn't know that Native people did hip hop. Right? I'm like, everybody does hip hop. I don't care where you are in the world. Everybody does some version of their own hip hop. And so, has the same issues, critiques around hypermasculinity, patriarchy, but also really good critiques of colonialism and so forth. And it's done by a lot of urban indigenous artists, especially since 80% live in cities, of indigenous peoples live in cities. So I love indigenous hip hop, and I wish they got more play on different sort of mainstream audiences.
Who's your favorite artist or artists? Who are your favorite artists right now? Shout out to names.
I gotta give a shout out to the Detroit folks. So shout out to Sacramento Knox, who's been doing a lot of cool activism as well in Southwest Detroit. Southie has done a lot of fantastic projects, and they can rap. That's the other thing. That's important to me. Like, you can actually
bring
rap.
it. You gotta bring it, right?
Yeah. Just because you're native and you have a microphone, and I'm not a rapper at all, but I have the critiques and understanding, like, what sounds good, and not everyone sounds good. It's not hating.
Would you say that? Would you say that the program Reservation Dogs is got a kind of like a hip hop culture, a flavor to it?
Yeah, no doubt. I did a interview with Mato, who's kind of the musical production person for the show, and I think he's curated. There's a lot of backlash. You get a lot of messages when the show first came out around anti-Blackness, and I'm like, I don't think y'all understand how Black culture circulates, and it's okay if non-Black people engage with the music, as long as they're respecting the people and the culture. I'm okay with it. So yeah, there's definitely some hip hop, Black cultural components to the show that I think are useful.
Wow. Well, Carrie, you want to say anything before we sign off today?
No, I love this conversation. I learned a lot, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to sit at your feet and to learn today. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here.
And if you ever do come up to Santa Barbara, let me know. We'll sit in the backyard, put on some Gil Scott Heron or something, and have some wine and just catch up with one another.
That sounds
welcome
good.
Here. All right.
Appreciate that.
Well, everybody, we've been talking with Kyle T. Mays, professor of African American Studies, American Indian Studies, and History at UCLA. And this has been a great gift to us. And we are stirred. We are motivated to do more research. I feel like this is an area that we can stand to catch up on. I think it's a vital piece to us building our imaginations, creating a vision for a better world. So I know that. Oh, I was going to ask you, Dr. Mays. I was going to ask you, when you saw Justin Pearson yesterday in Nashville, wherever they were in Tennessee. What's the capital of Tennessee again? Help me out. I'm spacing.
Is it Knoxville?
Knoxville. I'm assuming it was in Knoxville. When you saw him and you saw his hair, did you think Afro-Indigenous?
I had a lot of thoughts. I don't know if I'll say them on the program, but I was
all right. I
thought it was cool and slick back though, so I appreciated it.
I mean,
I did like it though.
I have relatives in North Carolina. In fact, when the family has a reunion, there are some who, they have indigenous ceremonies.
Huh.
And they present, they look like they could not be necessarily African American. And so that's what I thought of, because he looked like kin to me, but I don't know.
Could be. I'd never knock it. You never know.
Well, have a beautiful rest of your weekend, and Carrie, you too. And yes. We're signing off.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you so much for being here today. We are people who have left behind performance-based religion and the shame that comes with it. Maybe you have a personal liberation story to tell, and we want to know about it. Please contact us on Twitter at GodIsNotAnAsshole or text 805-703-8393, because the world needs to know that God is not an asshole.